Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. From the fog of war to the drums of war, Washington and its Western and regional allies are again agitating for a senseless conflict in the Middle East, this time against Syria. Again, it's all about weapons of mass destruction, an echo of the catastrophe called Iraq. Will Western military intervention in Syria only make things worse? To crosstalk the war in Syria, I'm joined by Yazan Abdallah in Damascus. He is a Syrian academic with the Syrian Foreign Press. In Washington, we have Michael Shank. He is the director of foreign policy at the Friends Committee on National Legislation and a professor at George Mason University. And in New York, we cross to Ed Krajewski. He is an associate editor at Reason 24/7. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. Michael, in Washington, if I can go to you first, Secretary Kerry is absolutely convinced that the Assad regime has used chemical weapons against his people. He doesn't give any proof, but he's absolutely convinced, and now we have the drumbeat to war. I think I saw this movie, and it has a very bad ending. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, certainly we did the same in Iraq. We undermined UN inspectors there. We're doing the same in Syria. We actually called on the inspectors in Syria to abort their mission, certainly paving the way for an easier strike on our end so we don't kill any UN inspectors. But it's a little spurious to say that we have the evidence when the inspectors actually don't have the evidence. So yeah, we're seeing echoes like you mentioned in the intro. This is a replay on Iraq.
Ed, how do you account for all of this? Because it sounds like a complete sham.
Well, it sounds like they're going to Damascus, even though maybe they don't want to. So it's interesting to see. It's kind of like who's leading this, you know, because you look at American intervention in Syria, and there's no really American strategic interest there. So, you know, is this going to be a repeat of Libya, where it's kind of the Europeans leading us along, and Congress isn't going to do anything about it? We know that already, and so that kind of leaves this president's foreign policy is aimless anyway. And this kind of it's another thing that's like we're not engaging, but we're intervening. You know, so it's not going to turn out good if cooler heads don't prevail.
Yes, and in Damascus, you're in Damascus. How do you see all of this? What's the timing all about?
Well, America is not going to be embarrassed repeating the actions of Iraq 10 years ago. America did it times and times before, and they are going to repeat it again. Now they're looking for a pretext. They've put forward that they're absolutely convinced that chemical weapons have been used by the Syrian government. They're not even interested in the results of the inquiry by the UN Commission. In fact, Mr. Kerry said that they're not interested in the results because they have made their own judgments. So they've made up their mind, it seems, that what they want is to employ force towards Syria, because clearly this move is because of the advancement the Syrian army has been making on the ground, and the American administration seems to be rather hysterical about the fact that the calculations have proven to be completely wrong from day one in the Syrian crisis.
Well, Michael, you know, they've been wrong from day one. They just keep getting it wrong, right? I mean, this is insanity.
Well, they've been wrong from the very beginning vis-a-vis Syria. I mean, we withdrew our ambassadors early on, kind of saying to Syria that we don't want to engage with you, we're going to demonize you, we're going to vilify you, we're going to isolate you, which makes it much easier for Assad or any leader to essentially go crazy on his own people. Let's be clear. I mean, the deaths that happened last week, Doctors Without Borders saying is 355. That's deplorable. Any death is deplorable, whether it's U.S. airstrikes in Iraq or in Afghanistan that kill hundreds of people, or chemical weapons in Syria used by someone, maybe the government, killing hundreds of people. Death is deplorable. But on Syria, we have not exhausted all means available. Certainly on the diplomatic front, we only engaged Russia primarily. That's like only engaging Israel on
just
Iran.
A little bit, okay? Because you're a good point. You know, Ed, they still had the peace process, quote unquote, but the Americans they dropped the ball every single time.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, maybe I'm reading into it, but maybe there's a little bit of a reluctance somewhere in the White House into getting into another quagmire, because, you know, Syria may not be Iraq, but it's not Libya either. Obviously, the presence of the Russians makes it a big difference.
Yeah.
So there's some strategic balance there that I don't think it's just not worth interrupting. You know, just like I don't really understand if these we'll see what the report says. There's supposed to be a U.S. report that's going to explain who used these chemical weapons. But, you know, if it was the Syrian government, just kind of, it almost doesn't make sense because who does it benefit? You know, at this point, like you said, they've got the advantage on the ground. So does it really make sense for them to now do something? President Obama's, he's moved the red line back before, you know, because at first he said when they use chemical weapons, and then they use chemical weapons, or he said they use chemical weapons.
Well, somebody might have used chemical weapons. Someone might have used chemical weapons. That's all we really know.
I mean, but the idea that Bashar Assad would order that now is, I mean, he could be completely deluded at this point, sure, but it just seems like a spectacular own goal if this came from the actual higher reaches of the Syrian government. And it ends in a Western intervention.
Yes, in Damascus, give me some logic here. What, in your mind, what is the timing all about in Damascus? What is the timing?
There are a few things to consider when you look at the timing. First, the advancements on the ground by the Syrian army, especially in the suburbs of Damascus. The areas that the Syrian army has captured recently are of strategic importance, and they will reflect a momentum that the Syrian army has started to establish from early this year and is going to mount more. So when they were talking about balance of power on the ground, they've clearly it's transpiring that this is not achievable for them, and the longer they wait for a political solution, the longer the Syrian army is going to the more the Syrian army is going to have control on the ground. That's number one. Number two, there seems to be an ongoing conflict within the American administration with two currents. One that is known to be very pro-intervention, the Hawks, the new conservatives, who are clearly applying extreme pressure on the Obama administration. Obama, coming from a Democrat background, has probably been a little bit more reluctant for intervention. He's clearly announced a policy that will try to avoid engaging in more wars. His priority is to withdraw from Afghanistan. So with more pressure, he's probably going to succumb to a compromise with those hawks inside the American administration and the advisors to take a scenario similar to Kosovo. That's the more scenario that I would imagine, that he would probably consider remote airstrikes without boots on the ground intervention or substantial military intervention.
Well, I mean, let me ask you a question. Let me ask you a question. Is regime change in the cards or stalemate, continued stalemate? Back to Damascus. What's the outcome?
Well, I mean, when you're facing a major power like the United States with a coalition of countries such as the United Kingdom and France and many other regional players, then of course airstrikes by a coalition from these countries would probably affect the balance on the ground and would probably eventually lead to perhaps a change in the stalemate, if that's what they're trying to achieve. However, that comes at the cost of destroying the Syrian state and the Syrian army. You cannot expect what perhaps a fool may do. I mean, they're very powerful, and they've done it before. They may do it again, but that comes at the expense of worsening the humanitarian situation in Syria and not improving it. So we have to be very clear here that when they claim that they're coming here for humanitarian reasons, it's the absolute opposite. They're coming here to actually create another humanitarian quagmire that will probably take decades to resolve, not only in Syria, but in the whole entire region.
Exactly right.
It was very funny. It was pathetic even to listen to Mr. Obama's interview with the CNN last week. When he talked about Syria for 3 or 4 minutes, he mentioned the international law and the international community more than 3 or 4 times. And he was always going back to the fact that he is going to seek an international mandate.
Yeah, but it's very interesting when the President of the United States says international law, it's synonymous with NATO. That's what it means to him, and that's what it means to this administration. Ed, you wanted to jump in. Go ahead.
Right.
Go ahead, Ed.
Yeah, if I could jump in, I mean, this is where I would say the blame lies with Congress, who over the last several decades has abdicated its war-making powers, because at the end of the day, it's Congress that would have to approve this, and only because of what Congress has done before is it that we're even in a situation now where President Obama can say, well, you know, I can go look at the international community and go look at NATO or say UN, not the UN in this situation, or the Arab League or whoever, and say I can get my authorization from them. That should have never happened. You know, it's the U.S. military that's supposed to be deployed for U.S. interests, and it's supposed to be approved by Congress. Congress has the constitutional authority to declare war, not the president, not the White House. And if Congress hadn't abdicated its constitutional authority there, we wouldn't be so close to the precipice. And that's a huge problem. You know, just the other day, Speaker Boehner's spokesperson said, you know, the Speaker made it clear that he wants Congress to be in consultation on any
he doesn't
possible
need
military
Congress
action.
because Western media, Western media is going for war.
So that people know who to blame when there's a war.
Michael, look at Western media. They're going for war. I mean, watch CNN.
Certainly, I mean, yep, CNN saying 1,300 died last week when Doctors Without Borders said only 355, which is still a serious amount of people dead, but CNN
and we still don't know how those people died. We still don't know how those people died.
Right. Peter, I want to address two things that have come up with both Dr. Abdullah and Ed. Congress and international law. In Congress, thankfully, there's a bipartisan effort in the Senate, bipartisan effort in the House. Senators Udall, Murphy, Lee, and Rand Paul in the Senate. In the House, Reps Welch and Gibson. Both bills banning military aid, U.S. military aid into Syria because they're worried that it would just escalate the violence and the deaths, which it would. But on international law, if the president really cares about international law, we would pursue something within the International Criminal Court. Certainly this has come up at the UN several times. The Human Rights Council pushing this forward, the High Commissioner of the Human Rights Council suggesting this be a referral to the ICC. That would allow us to arrest Assad or at least create an international narrative, a moral narrative.
All right, gentlemen, I have to jump in here. This is a very interesting discussion. We'll continue with international law after we turn from our break. Stay with RT.
Great, thank you.